Good morning, faithful listener, and welcome to the Bible Explained podcast. Today we're going to go over 1 Chronicles 7 through 9 and talk about the rest of the genealogies of Israel and how there's actually hope for Israel because the Israelites are finally coming back into the land. Stay tuned for today's discussion. If you guys didn't catch the end of yesterday's podcast, I have an exciting announcement. I actually followed through on my promise, or at least part of my promise. I promised you guys several months ago that I was going to go back and redo my first 70 episodes. Well, the first one is done. I finally got around to redoing Genesis 1 through 5. So I highly recommend going back and listening to that episode because it is completely different from what it originally was. So I'd love for you guys to go back and check it out. And it was a lot of fun for me to research the very beginning of Genesis where God creates the earth and some questions that a lot of people have regarding the creation story. Now, I do not know when I'm going to get the next episode up, though, because I'm not scheduling out redoing my first 70 episodes. I'm just kind of doing them when I have time. So the next one isn't scheduled yet, but I will let you guys know when I get it done. For now, I'm going to link Genesis 1 through 5 in the description of this episode so you guys can go over there and listen to it after you are done with today's episode. We are going to discuss 1 Chronicles 7 through 9 today and finish up all of the genealogies listed in 1 Chronicles. Now, I'm going to follow the same format that I've been doing with these genealogies. I'm not going to read the entire chapter for you guys. I'm just going to talk about notable names that we might know in these genealogies. Now, so far, we've already talked about the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Manasseh, and Gad. And today we're going to finish up by talking about Issachar, Benjamin, Naphtali, Manasseh, Ephraim, and Asher. Now, when I say tribes, what I'm talking about are the tribes of Israel. The tribes of Israel were named after the sons of Jacob. Okay, Jacob was one of the patriarchs of the nation of Israel. He had 12 sons, and each of them became one of the tribes of Israel. So starting out in 1 Chronicles 7, verse 1, this is talking about the tribe of Issachar, one of Jacob's sons. Verse 1 says, out of the WEB, the sons of Issachar were Tola, Puah, Jashub, and Shimron, 4. Now, this tribe produced a lot of warriors for Israel. It says in verse 4, with them by their generations after their fathers' houses were bands of the army for war, 36,000, for they had many wives and sons. So the tribe of Issachar produced a lot of warriors for Israel. But then moving on in verse 6, it says the sons of Benjamin. So now we're moving to the tribe of Benjamin. The sons of Benjamin were Bela, Becher, and Adil. Then it goes through all of the different sons of Bela, Becher. But when you get to Jediel's son, you'll notice here a guy named Ehud. Okay, it says the son of Jediel was Bilhan, and the sons of Bilhan were Jeush, Benjamin, and Ehud. Now, I don't know if you guys are going to remember who Ehud was. If I'm being 100% honest, I did not remember who Ehud was until I researched this chapter, and it mentioned that he was one of the judges of Israel. And I was like, oh yeah, he was a judge of Israel. In fact, Ehud was one of the first judges of Israel. He was the left-handed judge who saved Israel from the king of Moab. Ehud was a left-handed man, and so he pretended to be right-handed in front of the king of Moab, but then reached behind with his left hand and plunged the sword through this king, who, by the way, was a very, very big man. It says he was very fat, and the fat actually went over the sword, and the sword just got stuck inside of his bowels. And then, not to be too gruesome, but it literally says in scripture that his bowels came out with the plunge of that sword. So that is who Ehud was. He was a judge of Israel who saved them from the king of Moab by pretending that he was a right-handed man, but he was actually left-handed. And Ehud was from the tribe of Benjamin, related to Benjamin's son Jediel. And it says Jediel specifically had a lot of sons who turned into mighty men of valor, men who were ready for war. It says from Jediel came mighty men of valor, 17,200 who were able to go out into the army for war. Then in verse 13, all it says for Naphtali is the sons of Naphtali were Jaziel, Guni, Jazer, Shalom, and the sons of Bilhah. And that's literally all the information you get for the tribe of Naphtali. Verse 14 goes into Manasseh. We already talked about the half tribe Manasseh, because Manasseh was one of the few tribes that got split up, because half of Manasseh was content to live on the eastern side of the Jordan River, whereas the other half of Manasseh wanted to live on the west side of the Jordan River in the Promised Land. So Manasseh kind of broke up into two half tribes, if that makes sense. So we already talked about the half tribe of Manasseh that lived on the other side of the Jordan River, but now we're going into the Manasseh that lived in the Promised Land. And actually, if you look through the genealogy of Manasseh, there's a lot of women mentioned. And I don't know who any of these women are, but I did find it interesting that there are a lot of women mentioned, specifically wives and sisters and daughters. So that's kind of something interesting about the tribe of Manasseh that other tribes don't necessarily focus on. But then in verse 20 through 29, it tells a pretty interesting story about the tribe of Ephraim. So Ephraim was one of the tribes of Joseph, if you guys remember this. Joseph didn't really get a tribe of his own. Joseph's two sons got a tribe each. Manasseh split up into half tribes, and then Ephraim just remained one tribe, but those were the tribes of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. It says the sons of Ephraim were Shethulah, Bered, Tala, Elada, Taeth, Zabid, Shethulah, Ezer, and Eliad. And forgive me, I don't know if I botched any of those names. I am assuming that every single one of those names is incorrect, so I apologize for that. But it says here that Ezer and Eliad, in verse 21, were killed by the men of Gath because Ezer and Eliad went down to take away their livestock. So they were trying to steal livestock from the men of Gath, and those two kids of Ephraim got killed. So that's kind of a weird story that we haven't heard anywhere else in Scripture. But it says Ephraim was extremely sad, obviously, in verse 22. Ephraim, their father, mourned for many days, and his brothers came to comfort him. Ephraim went into his wife, and she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Beriah, because there was trouble with his house. The name Beriah is similar to the Hebrew word for misfortune, which that is a terrible thing to name your child. Especially back in these days, when names meant everything, like you were associated by your name. Pretty awful to name your child Beriah if it means misfortune in Hebrew. But that happened because Ephraim was so upset that his two sons, Ezer and Eliad, were killed because they were trying to steal cattle from the men of Gath. And, I love how we just see little stories like this throughout Scripture of how even in the very beginning, these men were all sinful, and yet God used these men for his good. In spite of their sin, God can use anybody. Every single person on earth is a sinner, and yet God can use all of that. He doesn't cause us to sin. It actually says in Scripture that he does not tempt us to sin. When we are tempted to sin or when we sin, that is on us. But God still works with us in spite of our shortcomings, just as he worked with the tribe of Ephraim. In fact, the tribe of Ephraim was one of the blessed tribes. Ephraim was blessed over his brother Manasseh, and that's talked about in Genesis chapter 48 when Jacob is about to die. He actually blesses his grandson Ephraim over Manasseh, even though Ephraim was younger than Manasseh was, which that was a big deal. Back in these days, the older brother was supposed to inherit everything, and the younger brother had an inheritance, I'm sure, of some sort, but was not the birthright holder, if that makes sense. But in Genesis 48, here's what happens. Starting in verse 13, it says, Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near to him. Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. He blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all the days of my life, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, let them grow into a multitude upon the earth. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. He held up his father's hand, removing it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this is the firstborn. Please put your right hand on his head." His father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also will become a people, and he also will be great. However, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his offspring will become a multitude of nations." He blessed them that day, saying, "Israel will bless in your name," saying, "God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh." He set Ephraim before Manasseh. And that actually did happen. Ephraim was a greater tribe than Manasseh was. But now moving on to the tribe of Asher. Quite honestly, there's not much to talk about here. It says the sons of Asher were Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, and Beriah, and Sarah was their sister. Now, the tribe of Asher historically was a very rich tribe of Israel. They had very good and fertile land. Apparently, also, the women of their tribe were very beautiful and got married off to kings. So yeah, the tribe of Asher did very well, got some very good land along the seacoast. And so that is 1 Chronicles 7. Moving into 1 Chronicles 8, it's going to delve into the history of the tribe of Benjamin a little bit more. In fact, chapter 8 is only about Benjamin because don't forget why all of this was written. When the author wrote this, he was writing it so that when the Israelites came back into the land after their exile, they would know where to go because, after they were exiled for 70 years in Babylon, they might forget where their tribal land was supposed to be unless there was a record of all of their families that told them which pieces of land their family owned. That is most likely why the author of Chronicles wrote all of this down, was because the Israelites were finally coming back into the promised land after their exile. So 1 Chronicles 8 focuses a lot on the tribe of Benjamin, specifically because the tribe of Benjamin had some very key cities that a lot of people lived in before the exile, specifically Jerusalem, the capital city of Judah. In 1 Chronicles 8, verse 1, it says, Benjamin became the father of Bela, his firstborn, Eshbel the second, Ahara the third, Noah the fourth, and Rapha the fifth. Then it goes into all the different sons of the sons, and I'm not going to get into that. Jumping down to verse 29, it talks about one of the descendants of Benjamin named Gibeon. It says, the father of Gibeon, whose wife's name was Maacah, lived in Gibeon with his firstborn son Abdon, Zur, Kish, Baal, Nadab, Gedor, Ahio, Zachar, and Mikloth, who became the father of Shimeah. They also lived with their families in Jerusalem near their relatives. Ner became the father of Kish. Kish became the father of Saul. Saul became the father of Jonathan, Malchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbal. The son of Jonathan was Meribal. Meribal became the father of Micah. Now you might recognize some of those names. That is the genealogy of the first king of Israel, whose name was Saul, who God fully rejected because Saul was, quite honestly, a terrible king. And he took the throne away from Saul and gave it to David. But that is the genealogy of Saul. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. But now we're going to move into 1 Chronicles chapter 9 and talk about this. And this is where the genealogies begin to end, because something really exciting has happened. Here's what it says in 1 Chronicles 9, verse 1. So all of Israel were listed by their genealogies, and behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel. Judah was carried away captive to Babylon for their disobedience. Now the first inhabitants who lived in their possessions in their cities were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. That right there is talking about the return of the Israelites into the land of Israel after the exile. Don't forget, the book of Chronicles was written after the Babylonian exile, where Babylon went into Judah and completely took over the land. This was written after that happened. And now in 1 Chronicles 9, it's actually saying that the Israelites are coming home. It says Judah was carried away captive to Babylon for their disobedience, and the first inhabitants who lived in their possession in their cities were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. So now the Israelites are coming back home. The exile of Babylon is over. It's been about 70 years since all of that took place, and now the Israelites are finally returning home. And you know what's really interesting about all of this is that Judah remained pretty empty, in spite of the fact that the Babylonians came in and carried a whole bunch of people off. After 70 years, the Israelites came back in to their own land. And you might be like, well, what about up north? You know, where Samaria was. It does say that the king of Assyria replaced all of the people up north in Israel with different people. And yes, that did happen, which is why Samaria, you know, the city of Samaria, was so hated in the days of Jesus, because foreign people had gone into Samaria, lived there, repopulated the area, most likely with other Israelites living there, and were considered to be pagan half-breeds in the days of Jesus. You know, when Jesus goes and talks to the Samaritan woman, the reason the disciples didn't want Jesus associating with that woman was because she was a Samaritan. She was from Samaria. So yes, that did happen up north. But down south where Judah was, the land, shockingly, remained relatively empty. And the Israelites were able to go back in and actually repossess the land that they previously owned. So that's something miraculous that God did for his people. And so all of 1 Chronicles 9 is talking about these people that have come back from exile. That is what this entire chapter is about. This is no longer talking about the genealogies of the past so much. This is talking about the people that now are coming back to Israel. So it's like a ray of hope after that long period of exile. And another exciting thing about all of this, there were two rays of hope, actually. Not only were the Israelites coming back to Israel, but notice here that there's no more division between Judah and Israel. You know, for centuries, Israel and Judah were in conflict. They split off from one another and became two separate nations. But now it says here that the Israelites, meaning all of them, were coming back to their land. There was no more division between Israel and Judah. It was just one country once again. So in verse 3, it says, "In Jerusalem there lived the children of Judah, the children of Benjamin, and the children of Ephraim and Manasseh." So look at that. There is no more conflict between the tribes of Israel any longer. They're all in unity with each other. So then it goes into the families that were living in Jerusalem through verses 4 through 9. Then it talks about, in verse 10, the priests. It says, "The priests that lived in Jerusalem were Jediah, Jehoiarib, and Jachin." But in verses 17 through 27, it talks about the gatekeepers of God's temple. This was something that David had set up centuries beforehand. And now that the new temple is being rebuilt, you can see that the priests and the Levites are anxious to get back to how things were before. You know, right now with the members, I'm going over the book of the Psalms on Fridays, and we're going through quite a few Psalms now that are written by the sons of Korah, who were priests. And a couple of these Psalms so far are just talking about how they long to get back to how things were before they went into exile or wherever they were when they were writing those Psalms. They're saying we long for the days when we are able to worship at Yahweh's temple. So you can see here in verses 17 through 27 that these priests and these Levites are just longing to get back to worshiping at the temple and setting things up the way it was before it was destroyed. Verse 27, they stayed around God's house because that was their duty, and it was their duty to open it morning by morning. They did it because they knew it was their duty, and they wanted to do it. 28 says, certain of them were in charge of the vessels of service, for these were brought in by count, and these were taken out by count. Some of them also were appointed over the furniture and over all the vessels of the sanctuary, over the fine flour, over the wine, the oil, the frankincense, and the spices. Some of these sons of the priests prepared the mixing of the spices. Mattiah, one of the Levites, who was the firstborn of Shallum the Korhite, had the office of trust over the things that were baked in pans. Some of their brothers of the sons of the Kohathites were over the showbread to prepare it every Sabbath. So yeah, you can see how anxious everybody is to get back to their land. You can imagine, living in exile for 70 years. was so draining. These people just long to get back to their homes. And I'm sure a lot of them really learned their lesson that they don't want to abandon God in the future, because bad things happen when you abandon Yahweh, especially when God says, I'm going to take care of you when you follow my laws. But if you don't follow my laws, bad things are going to happen to you. The people learned their lesson, and they're like, yes, we want to be in our homeland. We want to worship God because things were good when that happened. But to finish up in 1 Chronicles 9, the author does something kind of interesting here in verses 35 through 44. He talks once again about the tribe of Benjamin, and it's almost exactly word for word with what you'll find in the previous chapter. And a lot of people might be like, why did the author repeat this at the very end of 1 Chronicles 9? Well, this is the line of Saul, don't forget. Saul was the disgraced king who God took the throne away from and gave it to David. But even though Saul was disgraced, his line continued on. So all of 1 Chronicles chapter 9 is talking about hope, right? How the people are excited to get back home, how they're hoping to reopen God's temple and get things back to the way it was. And even Saul's line, the disgraced king of Israel, his descendants even have hope. So all of God's promises are coming to fruition with the Israelite people, and they're actually seeing all of that take place. So those are all the genealogies of Israel. And I hope you guys enjoyed kind of going through these things a little bit, because it's not only history, but it's also a refresher on some of the stuff we've talked about before. And in fact, 1 Chronicles is going to be a great refresher, because we're going to go over the entire life of David after all of this. So faithful listeners, I hope you stay tuned for all of that, but also tune in tomorrow for an episode from Philippians, which I'm very much looking forward to talking about that with you guys. And don't forget to click the link in the description that takes you to my remake of Genesis chapter 1 through 5. Faithful listeners, have a wonderful rest of your day. Happy listening, and God bless.